For 50 years, the story of the Terracotta Army seemed settled. Chinese craftsmen working entirely within their own artistic tradition built roughly 8,000 individualized clay soldiers to guard China's first emperor into the afterlife. Simple, self-contained, purely domestic achievement. Then, a team of archaeologists looked closer at the DNA left behind at the site, and the timeline of contact between China and the rest of the ancient world got thrown into serious question. Before we get into it, I want to be upfront about something, because a wave of recent videos has been circulating some genuinely fabricated claims about toxic death traps and suppressed research connected to this site, and none of that holds up to scrutiny. What actually happened here is a real, published, and still debated archaeological finding, and it's honestly more interesting than the manufactured version. Stick around, because this one touches something much bigger than one tomb. And if you like getting the real research behind viral headlines, subscribe now. Quick recap on the basics, since context matters here. The Terracotta Army was discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well near Xi'an in China's Shanxi province, part of the massive funerary complex built for Qin Shi Huang, the ruler who unified China's warring states into a single empire in 221 BC and became its first emperor. The clay army, estimated at around 8,000 soldiers along with hundreds of horses and chariots, was built to guard the emperor in death, each figure individually detailed with distinct facial features, hairstyles, and armor. An artistic and logistical achievement that took an estimated 700,000 laborers to complete over several decades. For most of the 20th century, the dominant assumption among historians was that this achievement was purely homegrown, a natural extension of existing Chinese sculptural and bronze casting traditions, developed with essentially no outside influence, since formal contact between China and the Mediterranean world wasn't believed to have existed until the opening of the Silk Road, generally dated more than a century after the emperor's death. That assumption started cracking in the mid-2010s. Researchers analyzing skeletal remains found buried near the mausoleum complex, not inside the famous soldier pits themselves, but in surrounding burial areas connected to the site, identified mitochondrial DNA consistent with European ancestry. That finding alone was striking, since it suggested people of Western Eurasian descent had lived, and eventually died, in this specific region of China at a time when direct contact between these two parts of the ancient world wasn't supposed to have existed yet. Around the same time, art historian Lukas Nickel, then at the University of Vienna and later at the University of Edinburgh, began building a broader argument connecting that genetic evidence to something purely stylistic, the sculptures themselves. Nickel pointed specifically to a separate set of finds from the same mausoleum complex, terracotta acrobats and strongmen, along with bronze sculptures of birds like ducks, swans, and cranes, arguing that their proportions, musculature, and overall naturalistic style bore a much closer resemblance to Hellenistic Greek sculpture from the same general era than to any earlier Chinese artistic tradition. Life-sized, individually detailed, anatomically naturalistic statuary simply didn't have an obvious precedent within China's own sculptural history up to that point, while it very much did exist within the Greek world, particularly following Alexander the Great's conquests, which had pushed Hellenistic Greek cultural influence deep into Central Asia in the centuries before Qin Shi Huang's reign. Li Shuzhen, a senior archaeologist at the Emperor Qin Shi Huang's Mausoleum Site Museum, who has worked directly on excavating the site for years, publicly backed the broader implications of this research, telling reporters that the emerging evidence pointed to genuine, direct contact between the first emperors China and the West, occurring significantly earlier than historians had previously assumed, predating the Silk Road's formal establishment by well over 1,000 years in terms of meaningful cultural exchange. The specific mechanism proposed by Nickel and his collaborators was that Greek sculptors, or at minimum, individuals trained directly in Greek sculptural techniques, may have traveled into the region and worked alongside local Qin artisans, teaching or influencing the specific naturalistic, life-sized approach that makes the Terracotta Army so strikingly different from anything China had produced before it. Now, it's important to be clear about exactly how contested this theory actually is within mainstream archaeology, because that's a detail a lot of viral coverage tends to skip. This is not a settled scientific consensus. Several archaeologists and historians specializing in early Chinese art have pushed back on the Greek influence theory fairly firmly, arguing that Nickel's stylistic comparisons, while genuinely interesting, remain circumstantial rather than conclusive, and that naturalistic sculptural development can plausibly emerge independently within a sophisticated bronze casting tradition like Qin dynasty China's without requiring direct foreign instruction to explain it. The mitochondrial DNA evidence, while real and published, comes from a limited number of skeletal samples found in the broader mausoleum complex, not from inside the soldier pits themselves, and critics have reasonably pointed out that isolated evidence of some Western Eurasian presence in the region doesn't, by itself, prove that specific individuals directly trained the sculptors responsible for the terracotta figures. So, the honest state of this research is a real, published, genuinely thought-provoking hypothesis, backed by actual DNA evidence and stylistic analysis from credentialed archaeologists, that remains a minority position, actively debated within the field rather than an established fact that's rewritten the history books outright. That distinction matters even more once you filter out what's actually circulating in a lot of recent video content about this site. Claims about mysterious, toxic death traps engineered into the soil, leaked internal government analyses, and researchers being suppressed or reassigned for speaking out don't trace back to any credible, published archaeological source. What is real, and has been documented by legitimate soil analysis for years, is that the region directly around the emperor's still unopened central tomb mound genuinely does show abnormally high mercury concentrations, corroborating an ancient historical account written by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, describing mercury rivers built into the tomb's design. That's real, confirmed, published science, but it's an entirely different, older, and already well-established finding, not some newly leaked 2025 discovery about a chemical death trap, engineered into the soldier pits themselves, which appears to be fabricated content dressed up to look like a legitimate archaeological announcement. So where does the real, credible research actually leave us? With a genuinely fascinating open question, rather than a dramatic, settled reveal. If Nickel's theory holds up under further investigation, it would mean meaningful cultural and technical contact between the Mediterranean world and China occurred well over 1,000 years earlier than the traditional Silk Road timeline suggests, which would be a significant revision to how historians understand the ancient world's interconnectedness. If it doesn't hold up, and skeptics turn out to be right that Qin dynasty artisans developed this naturalistic sculptural style independently, that's arguably just as impressive a story, evidence of a sophisticated artistic tradition capable of an enormous creative leap entirely on its own, without needing outside instruction to explain it. Either way, what's actually driving new understanding of this site isn't some sci-fi styled AI deep scan uncovering a hidden conspiracy. It's exactly what's been driving progress here for the last decade. Careful DNA analysis of skeletal remains, detailed stylistic comparison by trained art historians, and an ongoing, genuinely unresolved scholarly debate happening through peer-reviewed publication. Rather than leaked documents or suppressed whistleblowers, modern imaging and remote sensing technology, including ground-penetrating radar and muon tomography research proposed for the still-sealed central tomb, continue to add real data to this picture piece by piece, but nobody has cracked open some hidden chamber revealing a definitive answer to any of this, and it's worth staying skeptical of any video claiming otherwise. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If it turns out Greek-trained sculptors really did work alongside Chinese artisans more than 1,000 years before the Silk Road officially connected these two worlds, what does that tell you about how much of ancient global history we're still getting wrong, simply because we assume isolated civilizations stayed isolated until we have direct proof otherwise? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more stories that separate real contested scholarship from manufactured internet mystery, subscribe now, because there's plenty more of this coming.